On a rain-soaked night above a flooded runway, a private jet lost its grip on reality. The aircraft registration W9 skidded sideways, hydroplaned past the taxiway markers, and slid nose first into the drainage ditch. Water rushed into the cabin. Inside, a woman gasped, clutching her pregnant belly. Outside, a single father named Carter sprinted through the storm. Pride opened the jam door and pulled her free. Her name was Alexandra. She was a billionaire CEO who had just closed the deal of her life. He wrapped his soaking jacket around her shoulders. They thought it was a fleeting moment of mercy in the dark. The next morning, 3 gleaming black Cadillacs pulled up to Carter's front door. The coastal city had always been a place where storms rolled in without warning. The civilian airport sat on the edge of the port district where cargo planes shared tarmac space with private jets, and the maintenance hangars smelled like engine grease and rain. Carter Hayes had worked there for 11 years. He was 36, steady-handed, good with hydraulics and avionics. The kind of man who could diagnose a failing sensor by the sound it made. He lived in a small house with peeling paint 3 miles from the airport. His daughter Vivian was 7 years old, bright-eyed, obsessed with folding paper airplanes and arranging them on the window's sill in perfect rows. She had her mother's curiosity and Carter's quiet determination. Her mother had been gone for 4 years. Carter never talked about it. Alexandra Whitmore was 34 and controlled a financial empire most people only read about in headlines. Whitmore Capital had just finalized a merger with Rhodes Aeronautics, a deal that would triple her market position and secure her legacy as one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. She had blonde hair that fell past her shoulders, a sharp mind, and a 7-month pregnancy that made every boardroom negotiation feel like she was carrying the weight of 2 futures at once. The merger had been her obsession for 18 months. She had sacrificed sleep, skipped doctor's appointments, ignored the warnings about stress-induced complications. The deal closed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She boarded the private jet at 6. The storm hit at 7:30. Henry Clark was the maintenance crew chief, a man in his 50s who treated the airport like a second home. George Bellamy worked for the National Transportation Safety Board, methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who could piece together a disaster from a handful of burnt wires. Amanda Pierce was Alexandra's lead attorney, sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous in a courtroom. Gwen Larson ran public relations for Whitmore Capital with an iron fist and a velvet tongue. Clinton Rhodes was Alexandra's new business partner, a man who smiled too much and spoke in careful half-truths. Finn Oliver had been flying jets for 22 years and had never lost a passenger. William Stone was head of security, ex-military, the kind of man who noticed everything and said nothing. The conflict began the moment the jet's landing gear touched water instead of concrete. Within an hour, whispers started circulating online rumors of a drunk flight crew, pilot error, criminal negligence. Someone wanted to shape the narrative before the facts could speak. Alexandra's pregnancy made her simultaneously vulnerable and valuable. A CEO nearly killed while carrying a child was the kind of story that could destroy a company or elevate it to sainthood, depending on who controlled the microphone. And Carter, the mechanic who had been in the right place at the right moment, was now the only witness who could say what he saw when he opened that cabin door. The accident happened fast. The jet came in low, fighting crosswinds that pushed it sideways across the glide path. The computer flickered warnings that the pilot couldn't process quickly enough. The thrust reversers activated a half-second late. The brakes bit into wet pavement and found no purchase. The nose dipped as the landing gear caught the lip of the drainage channel, and the entire fuselage tipped forward into standing water. Inside, Alexandra felt her seat belt dig into her ribs. Her breath left her lungs. The lights went out. Water began seeping through the door seals, cold and relentless. Carter was 200 yards away, running a final check on a cargo plane's hydraulic lines. When he heard the grinding screech of metal on concrete, he turned and saw the jet's tail angled skyward, the nose submerged. He knew the design of that model emergency exits on both sides, manual override levers, but the front door would be jammed by water pressure if it went under. He grabbed a pry bar from his tool cart and ran. Henry shouted something behind him, But Carter didn't stop. His boots splashed through puddles. His breath came hard. The rain was so thick it blurred his vision. When he reached the jet, the fuselage was half submerged. The cabin tilted at a 40 degrees angle. He waded into the water up to his thighs, braced himself against the side of the aircraft, and shoved the pry bar into the door frame. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air. He pulled the door open and looked inside. Alexandra was still buckled into her seat, gasping. One hand pressed to her stomach. Her eyes were wide but focused. She wasn't screaming. She was trying to control her breathing, trying to stay calm for the child inside her. Carter unhooked her seatbelt, took her arm, and guided her toward the door. The water was rising. She stumbled on the tilted floor. He caught her, steadied her, and half carried her out into the rain. On the muddy bank, he knelt beside her and checked her pulse. It was fast but steady. He asked if she could feel the baby moving. She nodded, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. He took off his jacket, soaked and heavy, and draped it over her shoulders anyway. It was a pointless gesture, but it was the only thing he could think to do. She looked up at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, emergency lights were beginning to flash. Sirens wailed in the distance. Henry arrived with a first aid kit and a thermal blanket. Carter stepped back and let the professionals take over. But before he walked away, he glanced back at the jet's nose, still half buried in the water near the landing gear assembly. He saw something that didn't belong. A blackened streak along the sensor housing. The kind of burn mark that came from improper soldering or overheated components. It was subtle, easy to miss in the chaos. But Carter had been fixing planes long enough to know when something looked wrong. He said, "Nothing. Not yet." He just filed the image away in his mind and turned back toward the hangar. Water dripping from his hair, his hands shaking from adrenaline. By morning, the story had exploded. News vans lined the perimeter fence. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in a uniform. Gwen Larson issued a carefully worded statement praising the anonymous hero who had saved Alexandra's life while simultaneously controlling the narrative to avoid any implication of negligence. Amanda Pierce was already drafting liability waivers and preparing for potential lawsuits. William Stone posted security at the hospital where Alexandra was being monitored. Dr. Helen Matthews, the obstetrician on call, confirmed that the baby's heartbeat was strong and stable. The police took preliminary statements. Everyone wanted to know what had caused the crash. No one had an answer yet. Carter went home, peeled off his wet clothes, and checked on Vivian. She was asleep, her paper airplanes lined up on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of his bed, exhausted, and stared at his phone. There were 17 missed calls. He didn't return any of them. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want reporters at his door. He just wanted to go back to fixing engines and picking Vivian up from school and living a life that didn't involve billionaires or cameras or questions he couldn't answer. He thought about the burn mark on the sensor housing. He thought about the way the jet had skidded, the way the computer had lagged, the way everything had felt just slightly wrong. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But he was thinking. At 7 the next morning, Vivian woke him up by tugging on his sleeve. She pointed out the window. 3 black Cadillacs were parked in a neat row at the curb. Carter rubbed his eyes and looked again. The cars were pristine, polished, gleaming in the early light. Men and women in dark suits stood beside them, waiting. Carter's stomach tightened. He told Vivian to stay inside, walked to the front door, and opened it. The first Cadillac carried Amanda Pierce and William Stone. Amanda introduced herself with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She thanked Carter for saving Alexandra's life. She explained that Whitmore Capital wanted to ensure his privacy was protected, that his identity remained confidential, and that he wouldn't be harassed by the media. She offered him a temporary consulting position with the internal investigation team, a technical advisor role, paid generously with full legal protection. William handed him a business card with a phone number and nothing else. Carter nodded slowly. He didn't sign anything. He just listened. The second Cadillac carried Gwen Larson and 2 assistants. Gwen was polished, articulate, and relentless. She pitched Carter a different story. She wanted to frame him as the ordinary hero the working-class father who risked everything to save a life. She had a media strategy, a press release, a speaking contract with a 5-figure compensation package. All he had to do was agree to a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from discussing certain technical details of the accident. She slid a folder across the porch railing. Carter looked at it but didn't touch it. He asked what details she meant. Gwen's smile tightened. She said it was standard procedure, just protecting everyone involved. Carter said he'd think about it. The third Cadillac carried two men he didn't recognize. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't work for Whitmore Capital. One of them handed Carter a plain white business card with no name, no number, just an embossed logo he didn't recognize. The other man spoke quietly, almost apologetically. He said they represented a component supplier, Layan and Zane, and they understood Carter had been through a traumatic experience. They wanted to offer financial support enough to cover Vivian's school expenses, medical bills, whatever he needed. All they asked in return was that he refrain from speculating publicly about the technical cause of the accident. It was a courtesy, they said, a gesture of goodwill. The man left the card on the porch railing and walked back to the Cadillac without waiting for an answer. Carter stood there for a long time after the cars drove away. He looked at the business card with no number. He looked at the folder Gwen had left. He looked at Amanda's legal documents, and he thought about the burn mark on the sensor housing. He thought about the way the two men from the third Cadillac had phrased their offer. Refrain from speculating, not refrain from lying, not refrain from exaggerating, refrain from speculating, which meant someone was worried he had seen something worth speculating about. He picked up the plain white card, turned it over in his hands, and then set it down on the kitchen table. He didn't throw it away. He wanted to remember who had tried to buy his silence. The investigation began in earnest 3 days later. George Bellamy arrived at the airport with a team of federal inspectors and a steel case full of diagnostic tools. They pulled the jet's black box and downloaded the flight data recorder. Finn Oliver, the pilot, provided his logbook and a written statement. The data showed a cascade of failures, an erratic angle of attack sensor, delayed thrust reverser activation, sluggish braking response. The timeline suggested a mechanical malfunction, not pilot error. But George wasn't satisfied. He wanted to know why 3 separate systems had failed simultaneously. Carter approached George in the hangar and asked if he could look at the sensor assembly. George hesitated, then agreed. Carter wasn't officially part of the investigation, but Amanda Pierce had filed the consulting paperwork, so technically he had clearance. They walked out to the jet, still impounded on the tarmac, covered in tarps. Carter climbed up to the nose gear and examined the sensor housing. The burn mark was still there, faint but visible. He pointed it out to George. George took photographs, scraped a sample of the residue, and ran it under a portable thermal imaging scanner. The readings were wrong. The solder points showed signs of manual reflow, the kind of crude repair work done with a handheld iron instead of a factory standard wave solder machine. It looked like someone had tampered with the sensor or replaced it with a counterfeit part. George asked where the components had been sourced. Carter didn't know, but Henry did. The maintenance log showed that the angle of attack sensors had been replaced the week before, part of a routine upgrade. The supplier was listed as Layan and Zay components. Carter felt something cold settle in his chest. He remembered the two men in the third Cadillac. He remembered the plain white business card. He asked George if he could get a full audit of the parts shipment. George said he'd request it, but it would take time. Federal procurement records moved slowly. Carter nodded. He wasn't in a hurry. He just wanted the truth. Meanwhile, Alexandra was discharged from the hospital with strict orders to rest. She returned to her penthouse overlooking the harbor, surrounded by security and legal advisors and PR strategists. But she felt more trapped than protected. Clinton Rodas called her every day, urging her to finalize the merger paperwork, to sign the liability clauses that would shield both companies from legal fallout. He reminded her that the market was watching, that delays would spook investors, that she owed it to her shareholders to move forward. Alexandra listened, but she didn't sign. Something about the accident felt wrong. She kept thinking about the mechanic who had pulled her from the water, the man who had wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and asked nothing in return. She asked Amanda to find out his name. Amanda told her Carter Hayes, 36 years old, single father, worked at the airport for 11 years. Clean record, no criminal history, no social media presence, no public complaints, just a quiet man who fixed planes and raised his daughter and went home every night without making noise. Alexandra asked if she could meet him. Amanda said it wasn't a good idea, that it would complicate the legal proceedings, that would give the media a story they didn't need. Alexandra ignored her. She had William arrange a private car. No security detail, no cameras. She went to Carter's house on a Tuesday evening, carrying a gift for Vivian, a model airplane kit with intricate folding instructions and glossy paper. Carter answered the door and didn't recognize her at first. She was wearing jeans and a loose sweater. Her hair tied back, no makeup. She looked younger, softer, more human. She apologized for showing up unannounced. Carter let her in. Vivian was at the kitchen table arranging paper airplanes by wingspan. Alexandra knelt beside her and showed her the model kit. Vivian's eyes lit up. She asked if Alexandra knew how to make planes fly safely. Alexandra laughed. A real laugh. The first one in weeks. She said she didn't, but Carter probably did. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour, talking about nothing important. Alexandra asked about Vivian's school, about Carter's work, about the small routines that made up a normal life. Carter asked about the baby, about her health, about whether she was sleeping enough. She admitted she wasn't. She admitted she was afraid, not of the accident, but of the decisions that would come after. She said the shareholders wanted her to move forward, to close the merger, to pretend everything was fine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Carter listened. He didn't offer advice. He just listened. And when Alexandra winced, pressing a hand to her lower back, he showed her a breathing technique his wife had used during her pregnancy, a way to ease the pressure when the baby shifted. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a rescue fantasy. It was just one person helping another. As she was leaving, Alexandra turned to Carter and said, "If the truth needs someone to speak it, will you?" Carter looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the burn mark, the counterfeit sensors, the men in the third Cadillac. He thought about Vivian asleep in the next room, and the life he had built for her. And he said, "If the truth needs speaking, I'll speak it." The media storm hit 2 days later. Someone leaked footage from the airport security cameras, grainy, low resolution, but clear enough to show Carter pulling Alexandra from the wreckage. The video went viral. News anchors called him a hero. Online commentators dissected his background. Tabloid photographers camped outside his house. Vivian stopped going to school because the other kids wouldn't stop asking questions. Carter's supervisor at the airport called him into the office and told him regretfully that until the investigation was complete, it would be best if Carter took a temporary leave of absence. It wasn't a firing, it was a suspension, paid technically, but the message was clear. Stop talking. The legal threats came next. A law firm representing Lane and Zane Components sent Carter a cease and desist letter accusing him of making defamatory statements about their products without evidence. Carter hadn't made any public statements. He hadn't spoken to a single reporter, but someone knew he had examined the sensors. Someone knew he had talked to George Bellamy, and someone wanted him to stop. Amanda Pierce called Carter and told him not to respond, not to engage, not to give them ammunition. She said Whitmore Capital would cover his legal expenses if it came to that. Carter thanked her and hung up. That same week, Alexandra made a public announcement. She stood in front of the cameras, 8 months pregnant now, visibly exhausted, and thanked Carter by name. She said he had saved her life and her child's life, and that Whitmore Capital would be establishing an aviation safety scholarship fund in Vivian's name. She said the investigation into the accident was ongoing and that she was committed to full transparency regardless of the cost. The reporters shouted questions. She ignored them and walked off stage. Clinton Rodas watched the broadcast from his office and made a phone call. He was not pleased. Carter's world was falling apart in slow motion. The suspension meant no paycheck. The media attention meant no privacy. The legal threats meant no peace. He sat at the kitchen table with a stack of overdue bills and a calculator, trying to figure out how many months he could survive on savings. Vivian asked him why he wasn't going to work anymore. He told her it was temporary. She asked if they were going to be okay. He said yes, even though he wasn't sure. He had never lied to her before. It felt like swallowing glass. 2 nights later, Carter received a phone call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost friendly. The man said he represented certain interested parties who were concerned about Carter's well-being. He said it was clear that Carter was under financial strain and that raising a child alone was difficult. He offered to help. He said there was an envelope waiting for Carter at a parking garage downtown, 3rd level, Bay 47. Inside the envelope was enough money to cover 6 months of expenses, plus Vivian's school tuition, plus a little extra for emergencies. All Carter had to do was pick it up. No strings attached, no paperwork, just a gesture of goodwill. The man hung up before Carter could respond. Carter sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about the envelope. He thought about Vivian's tuition. He thought about the truth. And then he grabbed his phone, turned on the voice recorder, and drove to the parking garage. He found Bay 47, a man in a dark coat, was waiting beside a sedan. The man handed him a manila envelope thick with cash. Carter held it in his hands and asked very clearly who was paying him and what they expected in return. The man smiled and said it was just a gift, no expectations. Carter asked again. The man's smile faded. He said certain people would prefer if Carter didn't testify about the sensor components, didn't cooperate with federal investigators, didn't make things complicated. Carter asked if that was a threat. The man said it was advice. Carter handed the envelope back, thanked him for his time, and walked away. He had recorded the entire conversation. The next morning, Carter sent the audio file to Amanda Pierce. She listened to it twice, made 3 phone calls, and told Carter to stay inside his house until further notice. She said the recording was evidence of witness tampering, possibly bribery, and that it implicated Layan and Zane components in a criminal conspiracy. She said it changed everything. Alexandra was in her penthouse when Amanda played her the recording. She listened in silence, her hand resting on her belly, her face unreadable. When it finished, she looked at Amanda and said, "Find out who owns Layan and Zane." Amanda said she already had the company was a shell corporation registered in Delaware with ownership buried under 3 layers of holding companies. But if you followed the money far enough, it led back to a single name. Clinton Rhodes. Alexandra closed her eyes. She felt the baby kick hard, insistent. She said, "Cancel the merger." The revelation came from an unexpected source. Vivian was at the kitchen table playing with a model airplane kit Alexandra had given her. The kit included a sheet of stickers with registration numbers and component labels designed to make the model look authentic. Vivian was arranging them in order obsessively the way she arranged her paper airplanes. She noticed that the serial numbers on the stickers didn't match the sequence printed on the instruction sheet. She pointed it out to Carter. He looked closer. The numbers had been printed out of order, as if someone had mixed up 2 different batches. It was a tiny detail, meaningless in a toy, but it reminded Carter of something George Bellamy had said, that the sensors on the jet had mismatched batch numbers, as if they had been swapped from different shipments. Carter called George. George pulled the procurement records. The sensors delivered to the airport had been labeled as batch 7793, but the thermal residue analysis suggested they had come from batch 7937, a shipment that had been flagged 6 months earlier for quality control failures and recalled by the manufacturer. Someone had relabeled the defective sensors and sold them as new. Someone had falsified the paperwork, and that someone had a financial incentive to make sure the jet never flew safely. George sent his findings to the federal investigation team. They cross-referenced the batch numbers with shipping manifests, email records, and financial transactions. They found correspondence between an accountant named Lissa and someone identified only as CR, discussing margin adjustments and inventory reallocation. The emails were vague, coded, but the pattern was clear. Clinton Rhodes had been using Layan and Zane components as a front to supply substandard parts to aviation clients, pocketing the difference between the cost of counterfeit sensors and the price of legitimate ones. And when the jet crashed, he stood to benefit twice. Once from the insurance payout triggered by the accident clause in the merger agreement, and once from the increased valuation of Rhodes Aeronautics if Whitmore Capital was forced to accept his terms under duress. Amanda compiled the evidence into a legal brief. George submitted his findings to the National Transportation Safety Board. Alexandra reviewed everything twice and made her decision. She called a press conference. The conference room was packed. Reporters, cameras, analysts, shareholders. Clinton Rhodes sat in the front row, confident, smiling. He thought this was a formality, a final push to close the merger. Alexandra walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. She thanked everyone for coming. She acknowledged the accident, the investigation, the difficult weeks that had followed. And then she said, "I am formally withdrawing Whitmore Capital from the merger with Rhodes Aeronautics." Effective immediately, the room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Clinton stood up, his face red, his voice loud. He said, "You can't do this. You owe me this deal." Alexandra looked at him calmly and said, "I owe you nothing." She nodded to Amanda, who stepped forward and played the recording of the bribery attempt on the overhead speakers. Carter's voice filled the room, asking who was paying him and what they expected. The man's voice followed, advising Carter to stay silent. The room went silent. Amanda handed a document to the bailiff standing by the door. She said, "We are submitting all evidence to the federal investigation, including procurement records, email correspondence, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Layan and Z Components is owned by Clinton Rhodes. The sensors that caused the accident were counterfeit, relabeled, and sold knowingly. This is fraud. This is bribery. And this is over." 2 federal agents entered the room. Clinton tried to leave. They stopped him. They read him his rights. He was arrested on charges of fraud, bribery, and endangering public safety. The cameras captured everything. Finn Oliver, the pilot, was exonerated. The crew was cleared of all wrongdoing. The airport lifted Carter's suspension and invited him to return to work. But Alexandra made a different offer. She asked him to lead a new technical safety oversight team funded by Whitmore Capital, dedicated to auditing aviation suppliers and ensuring that no counterfeit parts ever entered the system again. Carter accepted. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about redemption. It was about making sure no one else had to pull a pregnant woman from a sinking jet because someone had decided profit was worth more than safety. Leon and Zane Components was raided by federal authorities. Lissa, the accountant, cooperated with investigators and provided testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. Clinton Rhodes was denied bail. The case moved to trial. The media called it the biggest aviation fraud scandal in a decade. Alexandra gave birth to a healthy daughter. 3 weeks later, she named her Grace. 6 months after the accident, Whitmore Capital held a ceremony to launch the Vivian Hayes Aviation Safety Scholarship. It was held at the airport in a hangar that had been converted into an event space. Vivian wore a blue dress and carried a paper airplane she had folded that morning. She stood on stage beside Alexandra and Carter and a dozen other people whose names she didn't know. Alexandra gave a speech about courage, about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, about the importance of speaking the truth even when it was difficult. She didn't mention Clinton Rhodes. She didn't need to. Everyone knew. At the end of the ceremony, Vivian launched her paper airplane. It glided across the hangar, caught a draft, and soared higher than anyone expected. The crowd applauded. Alexandra smiled, holding baby Grace in her arms. Carter stood beside her, quiet, hands in his pockets. He looked out at the crowd and saw George Bellamy, Amanda Pierce, Gwen Larson, William Stone. He saw Henry Clark, his old crew chief, nodding with approval. He saw Finn Oliver back in uniform, ready to fly again. And he saw 3 black Cadillacs parked outside the hangar, gleaming in the afternoon sunday. This time they weren't there to intimidate or bribe. They were there to escort Carter and Vivian to the reception, a gesture of respect, a symbol of how power could be transformed into honor when the truth was spoken. The rain had stopped weeks ago. The skies were clear. And somewhere in the wreckage of a sinking jet, buried beneath water and metal and lies, the truth had clawed its way to the surface. Carter had spoken it. Alexandra had believed it. and together they had pulled each other from the darkness into something that looked like justice, felt like redemption, and tasted finally like the air after a storm. Clean, cold, and